Renee, hey, congratulations on the composition for our Pound J.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited to be in the festival. So, yeah.
Yeah, so what was your initial reaction when you heard that this film was going to be in the festival?
I immediately ran over to my wife because Carrie sent me a text way before they had announced, and he was like, "Oh, don't say anything, but we're going to be premiering at a little snowy festival in January." And I just immediately went like, "Oh my God, we got into Sundance!" And so I ran over to my wife and showed her the text message. And then it was so terrible that for the next couple of weeks I couldn't say anything to anybody because I was like bursting with excitement and wanting to tell people, but it was like, why aren't they announcing yet? Why aren't they announcing yet? And then the days kept rolling by and it's like they announced by this time previous years. Why are they? um, but it was very exciting. It's been a long time, like couple years career goal of mine to score a movie that premieres at Sundance. So it's a very significant moment for me.
Would you say because I know you've been doing this for a long time, but would you say basically this was like the biggest prize so far for you?
I feel on a personal level, in terms of like where I see myself with goals and what I'm trying to achieve, I think this is definitely an important stepping stone, in terms of like being able to be attached to a project that already before even people see it, they already kind of know what the content is in terms of obviously it's Romeo and Juliet. It's such a classic story. So I feel like it has a lot of value for me to have the privilege of being attached to this project. And I feel like it has the potential of becoming a stepping stone, of like being able to generate some kind of exposure, for myself, because up to this time, I've gotten the privilege of working on a lot of TV shows and that kind of stuff, but it was never under my name. And so since I've been kind of working on my own and doing these sort of more like independent films and pursuing that career, I feel like this is the first movie that is getting a different level of exposure, if that makes sense. So it's definitely significant and emotional for me to be like, okay, we got to be ready for to keep pushing, once this moment passes.
Well, then tell us, how did your journey, were you brought on board to our hashtag J?
Yeah.
Uh,
So I've been friends with Carrie Williams, the director, for several years now. I'd say probably 3 or 4 years since we've known each other. And we met at a film independent event. A mutual friend introduced us, and we kind of hit it off right away. We had a lot of mutual interest, and we liked the same kind of music and some kind of films. So we became friends and would always share, stuff we were interested in. And then he had a short film called Emergency a couple of years ago in which he used one of my tracks just as source music to play on a video game that a character was playing or something like that. But then that film got into Sundance, and that was like his first short, I think, at Sundance. And so we always, like I said, we always kept in touch, and we're always looking for opportunities to work with each other. So when he got hired on to direct this movie, he just gave me a call. He likes the kind of music that I make, and he felt that it would be the right fit for this kind of new, bold, modern adaptation that they're going for. And obviously, once I got the call, I was immediately on board.
What was your first reaction to a film like this? Because this is not a typical regular film because it uses a lot of the style uses a lot of, like social media apps to
Mhm.
to tell its story. So what was your first initial reaction?
Yeah, well, my first reaction was confusion because I was like, "Wait, what? How is this working?" And then he pointed me towards Searching, which is a movie that the producers did, I think in like 2017 or 2018, which was the first one to adapt the screen life format that Timur Bekmambetov kind of created. And once I was able to watch that movie, I was like, "Oh, I get it." And it kind of like grabs you And I think it's very interesting because it kind of channels our psyche and what we're used to doing on our phones with social media. You know, when you kind of like go down a rabbit hole of looking at other people's business of comments and the arguments that are blowing up and stuff that you shouldn't be looking at. And that's what the movie feels like. So the whole time you feel like you're kind of lightly stalking on Romeo and Juliet and the whole drama that, you know, takes place between their families.
So how did you want to approach it after discovering that it was
Mm.
basically, like searching or stalking through their text messages and so on? How did you want to approach, your music to adapt into those specific type of scenes?
Yeah, so Carrie had a very like clear vision of the type of music he wanted to do, and we knew we wanted to approach it from a more electronic and experimental standpoint to kind of, you know, match the boldness of the visual aesthetic that we were going for. And so when it came time to score these scenes, a lot of these scenes don't necessarily have dialogue. You know, it's just kind of like the character looking through these posts or like reading news articles of things that are, and so the turning points in the stories oftentimes happen visually, not audibly. So the music kind of obviously had to hit certain points to be like, well, you should be reading here by now, so this is what, you know. So it almost became like a predictable, like predicting the interaction of the audience so that the music would kind of guide them to where they needed to go, you know, emotionally. Obviously without being too on the nose and being like, oh, and now you should be tense, you know. But it was very interesting because, you know, Carrie would often tell me, no, we got to do less. We got to do less in terms of music, but we got to push the envelope. We got to make it sound like nothing we've ever heard before. So that was a very interesting kind of like conflicting approach for me to figure out of how to push the envelope while doing less at the same time, you know. But I think the approach was effective because, you know, when you're reading or when you're studying and when you're doing stuff that requires you to concentrate and you have music on, the music can't distract you, you know. So to some extent, the music had to carry those scenes, but it also couldn't distract the audience from what they were supposed to be reading or focusing on visually. So it was very interesting.
How did it feel for you for the fact that your music was what was basically a focal point in those scenes because there is no dialogue, so people are just concentrating on the visuals or what they actually see during when your music actually comes up.
Yeah, well, I feel like it's kind of for us composers, I think I don't want to speak for the whole of the composers, but I think for me, it's always either exciting or nerve-wracking to know that our music is in focus to some extent, because most of the time our job is to slip by unnoticed, you know? And even in these scenes where the music is AKA in focus, it also had to slip by unnoticed, you know? So it was somewhat nerve-wracking also, you know, considering the size of what Romeo and Juliet is in terms of IP and how many people know it and how many people have preconceived notions of what it should be or shouldn't be, you know, and we were obviously taking risks here. So it was a little stressful, but I feel like Carrie created a really comfortable environment in allowing experimentation and not being afraid to try stuff that normally wouldn't be associated with this kind of approach or this kind of story. Also, because this kind of approach hasn't been done very much, you know, so we're kind of creating on new territory to some extent. And he was very welcoming and very open to exploring whatever would come out of that and then guiding us once we had something to work with.
So let's talk about the process that you came up with our hashtag J here. Did Carrie present you to the scene and then you composed something for that, or did you compose something first and then try to match it to the scene?
No, for most of the movie, it was always me writing to picture. So the scenes were already cut in place, and I was kind of writing specifically to that based on conversations that we had already had about what points in those scenes we had to highlight and where did we have to turn or duck or do whatever the music needed to do. But there were 2 or 3 moments in the movie where he had placed some previous music of mine from just self-released music that wasn't tied to any particular movie from my catalog, and he had used it as temp music in some of those scenes. And when we were talking about it, that music was working so well in those scenes, and because it hadn't been used in anything yet, we decided to just license it and keep it in the movie. So there were 2 or 3 instances where music had been previously written, not even thinking about the movie, but it worked so well that we just couldn't even try to replace it. It was like, why would we even, So
So overall, how many tracks did you come up, original tracks that you came up with for the film?
Well, the interesting thing about this project was that the tracks were longer than I'm normally used to. Most of the films I've scored, the tracks will often be around around 30 seconds to a minute and a half long. So then the number of tracks becomes long. Whereas in this movie, most of the tracks were between the 2.5 to 4 minute range, So I maybe ended up writing about 10 cues total approximately. And there's also a lot of songs in the movie too, which I didn't write, of course. So I had to kind of like weave in between songs. And they're also very contemporary music. So it also had to kind of be in a similar style so that it would transition seamlessly.
So let's talk about your style here, where you rely a lot on electronics. How do you like to accomplish those?
Well, I always approach it from an experimental and collaborative standpoint, if that makes sense. Like I collaborate with my electronic equipment in a similar way that I would collaborate with a musician if they were in the room. And the way that works is that I can set up certain parameters. I can program certain parameters in the electronic instruments to be self-narrative in some way so that they're constantly generating different information. And then I kind of manipulate that information. So it becomes a thing of like, oh, where is the synth wanting to take me, And then being like, yeah, I think that way will work, or being like, no, buddy, we actually have to go this way. But then I also like incorporating several Latino instruments that I have around here and using them so like I'll record a phrase or a 4-bar melody or something, and then I will take that audio and process it through the electronic equipment or other effect units that I might have. And I end up creating textures or pads that kind of create the undertone of a scene that I then compose more like proper music on top of, if that makes sense.
Tell me some of these Latino instruments that you actually use, because they're what,
Yeah.
acoustics, right?
Yeah, so for this movie, I used a lot of the Venezuelan cuatro. I used some of the Puerto Rican cuatro as well, and a Mexican vihuela were kind of the main instruments that I also used like traditional acoustic guitars as well. But they're so mangled and processed that unless I were to point them out and be like, oh, this was the cuatro, like you wouldn't really clock them. And that's something that I like doing, is like taking these instruments and like stretching them past what they were traditionally created to do, and hopefully incorporating them to become like something that you would normally hear without really hearing in film scores.
You always wanted to be a musician. I'm gathering like a lot of phenoms. You started young.
Yeah, so I started when I was 11 years old. I started playing drums. That's what I began doing. I wanted to be like Travis Barker from Blink 182. And I hope that one day I can hire him to play drums on one of my scores. But yeah, so then shortly after that, my dad bought me a guitar about a year later, and I was kind of like self-teaching myself to play songs that I used to like. I remember like Three Doors Down's Kryptonite or Creed Higher or these kinds of like very cheesy pop rock songs that were on MTV or VH1 at the time. So in self-teaching me these songs, um, I would mess up and play chords that weren't the right chords, but then I was like, oh, that actually doesn't sound bad. And then I slowly started realizing that I could kind of come up with my own chord progressions and start writing my own songs. And so that was when I started playing in a lot of rock bands through my teens that I was like the lead singer or the songwriter of and things like that. So yeah.
Did you go into any schooling, or do you find that by self-teaching was a better way of towards like experimental music?
Yeah, well, I mean, I eventually I took some guitar lessons and some drum lessons, but I didn't last very long just because I've never been one to practice scales or one to I just want to do the thing, so I wouldn't call myself a skilled musician more than I actually consider myself a writer or a composer, and when it came time to go to college, I did want to pursue songwriting, but that wasn't as viable an option in Puerto Rico. But we did have a classical conservatory of music, which then people convinced me that classical composition was the same as songwriting without the lyrics. It was not. But so I went in there and I started my bachelor in classical composition, and that was the first time I came across an orchestra, no, and the greatness and the sound of an orchestra, and that kind of changed the whole music making approach that I had. And I started looking for ways of incorporating my songwriting background with this classical music. And it wasn't until I saw The Holiday by Hans Zimmer, The Holiday, which is a romantic comedy that Hans Zimmer did the music for, that I heard something that was like, oh my God, this actually combines everything that I'm interested in, because it had acoustic guitars, it had drums, it had strings, it had woodwinds, and it had electronics even. So it was like, oh, so film music is what I need to be after. Um, and so that was kind of the turning point for me to know the path that I had to pursue artistically. And I started reaching out to student filmmakers in neighboring schools and just kind of begging them to let me score their short films so that I could start trying out this thing. And so I essentially did that on the side as I was pursuing my classical composition bachelor's degree, which obviously gave me a ton of tools from the classical composition theory and all of that that I obviously now implement in my scoring without really thinking about it.
So do you remember your first major project in your career when you finally got on board onto like a large project? Was it like a TV project?
Yeah, I'd say the first time that I felt like, oh crap, I can actually consider myself a professional in some way, was when I started working as an assistant for Blake, and then eventually when he gave me the opportunity to write additional music on the TV shows he was working on, I would try not to psych myself out, but anytime a guest star would come in on the shows and I'd be like, oh my God, that's the guy from Rent. I love Rent and I'm writing music, and it was like a trip. And then it was also a trip to think that straight out of what I was writing on the computer, obviously with feedback and input from Blake and from the producers, it was going straight out to millions of homes to be listened to a week or two later. So that was kind of very overwhelming and kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm actually doing what I wanted to be doing, and then after that, every project that I've been doing on my own also just reiterates that feeling, because now I am kind of, doing my own projects and being the lead composer on these films and getting to make a living out of doing what I love every day. So it's all like a process, and I'm so excited for, the next 5, 10 years, 20 years of hopefully continuing to be able to do this. Yeah.
So what's your ultimate goal? What do you aspire to?
Yeah. I'd say, I mean, I'm definitely interested in writing music for movies or TV shows that either impact people in a positive way. Like I don't know about you, but I've seen so many movies that impact me and inspire me to reflect on the way I'm leading my life and then create changes that obviously benefit everyone around me. So my goal would be to write music for projects that inspire that in people. You know, a lot of the times the type of projects that I love are psychological thrillers or that kind of stuff where the line between right or wrong is somewhat blurred. And I feel like those movies inspire conversations after the movie and inspire discussion about, well, was that wrong or was that right? Am I doing that thing that they say was wrong, but I don't think is wrong? You know, so that kind of thing I love. And I also love coming of age stories, whether it's like teenagers or, you know, early 20s or 30s people kind of like coming into their identity and figuring out who they are, because I feel like our generation has struggled a lot with being told that we had to get a job and we had to work for other people, and then the generation underneath us kind of telling us like, no, screw that, like take care of yourself, you know. So it's I love those kind of stories again that inspire change and inspire people to lead better lives.
Excellent. Well, let me wrap it up with one more question with you that I have is because are you're in what? I'm assuming you're either in Puerto Rico or Los Angeles or
I'm in Los Angeles. Yeah, I'm based here. I've been based here since 2013 now. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. So obviously you and I, because of crazy times, we're talking, you know, via Zoom right now. But I want to know is how are you staying sane and creative during all this time?
Yeah, well, fortunately, other than a couple months of a lull that I had over the summer, post-production I can do from my home. I do from my home anyway. So the only difference with projects is that I would, whenever I'm working on a project, I try to have the director come over to my studio at the end of the week, you know, every week or every other week to see the progress we've made and kind of talk about the music in person and make any revisions in person, because I feel like that creates an environment that allows the director to feel like he's part of the process versus the way we're having to do it now, where it's like I'm sending them QuickTime files for them to review and then give me a call and we'll talk about it. And it's just not the same kind of chemistry.
Mhm.
But other than that, from a personal standpoint, I am very fortunate to be married. I have a wife who means the world and is extremely supportive. And we also just had a baby girl in February before everything kind of blew up. So being a parent for the first time and being able to spend all this time with my wife has definitely kept me sane, you know, and kept us kind of not feeling secluded and alone, as I'm sure a lot of people have had to deal with. So I feel very blessed to have had that support. Yeah.
Well, then I'm actually going to have to tell you that for the past 12 months, you actually had a good year in your own way.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's been terrible for a lot of people, and you know, I obviously I can't compare. The only thing that I've suffered is not being able to share our baby daughter with my family who's in Puerto Rico, because we did have plans to fly there so that they could all meet her, you know. But when you compare that to the struggle that so many other people have been having, you know, I don't think it's even fair for me to even say that that's, you know, so yeah,
Yeah.
feeling very grateful.
Well, absolutely. Well, hey, congratulations once more for your composition for our hashtag J. Wish I could have been in Utah with you, you know, checking out on the big
Yeah,
screen, but I did have a chance to actually watch it. I loved it. I love the unique
that's
of
awesome.
it.
Yeah,
So it is a pretty awesome movie, and I could actually see a wider distribution, and
fingers crossed.
you'll hopefully you'll be discovered and more projects will come in.
Hope so too. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Hey, thank you. Bye now.
Bye.